Hi, everybody. Welcome. It's really great to see all of you, or at least see your names, and that's fine too if cameras aren't going to be on. We'd love to see your faces if you would so like to, but totally up to you. A little brief rundown. I am Madeline, Dr. Madeline Barlow, the Director of Programming at the Hidden Opponent. If we have not met yet, hopefully we will at some point, but really glad that you are here with us tonight. So we are going to dive right in, and I'm going to start off by reading the bio of our wonderful presenter tonight, Matisha Williams. Matisha earned her Master's of Arts at St. Mary's University of Minnesota in Marriage and Family Therapy in 2008 and is a practicing licensed marriage and family therapist. Matisha returned to St. Mary's University, where she is currently pursuing her PsyD in counseling psychology. Amazing. Her therapeutic approach has a multicultural feminist foundation with a combination of narrative, solution focus, and cognitive behavioral influences. Matisha makes an effort to cultivate a secure and balanced space while acknowledging possible intersecting identities of all individuals with unconditional positive regard. Matisha also has a professional background working with individuals in crisis, in forensic settings, dealing with life transitions, grief and loss, mood disorders, and thought disorders. She has worked with individuals of all ages. Prior to returning to St. Mary's to complete her doctorate, Matisha worked for over 10 years within marginalized communities in Illinois and Minnesota in a variety of different environments, including community mental health, private practice, outpatient clinics, corrections institutions, and hospitals. As a former collegiate athlete, Matisha is marrying her passion for sports and psychology, as sports psychology has become her specialty area, and she is currently in the process of completing requirements to become a certified mental performance consultant. Amazing. Love it. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Matisha.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barlow. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm just checking to make sure we got everyone. So I am going to maybe give like another minute for people who maybe want to join, and then we're going to jump right in. Also, if you all have questions while we go, please put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand or just unmic and unmute, not unmic, unmute and interrupt me to ask me. Please don't feel like you have to wait till the end. I know that can be very hard to do sometimes. And feel free to put your video on, but like Dr. Barlow said, if this is better for you to have it off, there is no problem with that. We got another couple people. Let me let them in. And can everyone hear me okay and see me okay? Because I'm going to share my screen. Okay, good. All right. So I do have a PowerPoint. And so I'm going to provide you with a lot of information. And we're going to do a little activity. So let's go ahead and share. Okay. And then, all right. Can everyone see my screen? Is the PowerPoint popping up? Awesome. Okay. All right. So, again, I'm Matisha. I identify as a cisgendered Black female. And I use the pronoun she, her. And I'm starting with that because we are talking about intersectionality in sport today. Okay. So, first thing that I wanted to do is define intersectionality. I'm sure you've heard it. It's been more of a pop culture word in the last few years. Since COVID and since George Floyd, people have spoken more about intersectionality. And so I wanted to provide the actual clinical term for everyone. So this was coined by Kimberly Williams in 1989. Let me go ahead and admit that person. As a way to highlight that gender, race, and class are interconnected, and at times that it can provide privilege and oppression. So from a multicultural framework, we emphasize intersectionality because people hold many different identities which are always present and therefore intersect with each other. Versus traditionally, people have thought of people's identities as separate and that people purposely choose to ignore specific identities, and that's not the case. They're always intersecting, they're always with you. So it's very important to acknowledge this for athletes. When I think about this and think about my experiences, whenever someone talks about identities, they will talk about their racial identity, their cultural identity, their gender. Nobody asks anyone about their athlete identity. And so that is why I also just want to highlight that this is specific to athletes because athletes deserve to have their identity spoken about and to understand more about athlete identity and how it intersects with with the rest of their identities. All right, so we're gonna play 21 questions, but it's like the privileged walk version of 21 questions. If anyone has ever seen the privileged walk or actually engaged in the privileged walk, it's where you're asked a number of questions, and if you're in person, what would happen is if that question is true for you, you take a step forward. And some of the questions will ask you to take a step back if that question is true for you. And all of those questions are based off of potential identities that people could have. So we're going to do a different since we're virtual. So it's 21 questions. So the total amount of points you could potentially get are 21. So I'm going to ask you to give yourself a point and take away a point. So if you have some paper, I'll give you guys a few seconds to get paper and pen together. And I'm going to ask 21 questions and let you know when you're supposed to give yourself a point or take it away. And what might be easiest for you is for you to give, like, say, -1 on a piece of paper or +1. And then at the end, we'll add up the pluses. And I'm going to ask you to put if you're comfortable, to put your scores in the chat. All right. Everyone, does everyone understand? Does anyone have any questions? No, everyone good? Okay, because I can't see everyone now.
I don't have my AirPods.
Is that a question? I thought I heard someone.
No, you're good. I think they just unmuted.
Okay, okay.
All good.
Thank you. All right, first question. Give yourself a point if you have played your current sport since elementary or middle school. Take away a point if you have ever been misgendered by people close to you, coaches, or teammates. Take away a point if you had to stop playing a sport because your family could not afford it. Now, let me know if I'm going too fast. Take away a point if you ever had to borrow equipment from another family member or teammate because you could not afford your own equipment. Give yourself a point if you never heard your parents discuss not being able to afford your sport or sports. Take away a point if you ever had to live with a teammate so that you were in the high school district that had a team that was scouted by colleges. Give yourself a point if your parents played sports at the college level or coached sports at any level. Take away a point if you were not able to play a sport of interest because you could not access the equipment or practice area due to a disability. Give yourself a point if your parents or close family member played professional sports. Take away a point if you have ever had to fib about your age to play a sport. Give yourself a point if your parents, family, and friends were able to attend 50% or more of your competitions prior to college. Take away a point if your family, friends, or parents attended less than 50% of your competitions. Take away a point if you and or your partner have a child or you are a caregiver or you are in a caregiver role for a family or friend. Take away a point if you have ever been told that you should or could not play a sport because it will mess up your hair. Take away a point if you lived in a community or went to a high school that did not have access to sports like golf, swimming, lacrosse, tennis, badminton, or soccer. Give yourself a point if you began playing sports between the ages of 4 and 10. Take away a point if you were ever told you could not engage in a sport due to a disability. Take away a point if you were ever told you could not engage in a sport due to religious or cultural reasons. Take away a point if you were discouraged and told that individuals with your culture, gender, race identity, or disability did not make it to the professional levels. Give yourself a point if you attended a high school that had sports like lacrosse, golf, swimming, tennis, badminton, and soccer. Take away a point if you witnessed a violent event during any sports season. Okay. So that was all 21 questions. If you all are comfortable, whoever's comfortable, please go into the chat and put in your scores. Oops. Okay, Abigail has a 1, 1, 5. Yeah. My prediction was that it'd be very, very shocking if someone had 21 or if several people had 20, or I'm sorry, not 21, had the total amount of positive points you could have, which are not, which are actually, I think it was 10, 9, 6, 8. But with taking away points, I wanted to see if anyone would be in the negative. So anyone who is adding, and thank you so much for those of you who have put your scores in there. Anyone in general, even if you didn't put your scores in the chat, anyone want to share like doing this activity here and seeing their score, what it brought up for them?
For me personally, I think it made me realize that there are so many different things that can prevent athletes or that athletes are told should prevent them from participating in sports that I hadn't considered before.
Thank you, Caroline. Yes.
For me, it kind of made me more aware of all the opportunities that I've been given and how I'm blessed to have these opportunities, and a lot of others don't have them. So just showed me how lucky I am to have all these opportunities as an athlete and a student athlete.
Thank you, Jack.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll tell you, for me doing these, writing these questions, as someone who identifies as Black and female, I recognize that I did have more privilege than I was able to feel like I had in the moment playing sports, because I did have access to soccer at my high school. Whereas just about everyone else in my family or everyone else that I knew that was a Black person did not know what soccer was and never played it. There was a badminton team, a tennis team at my school. And so I did have access to more sports. And even with like the support I had around that, my parent was very supportive of me playing sports, and not every athlete has that. But you hit the nail on the head, Jack, with part of this is to recognize the amount of privilege that you do have, but also that some people don't get the same opportunities. And thank you, Gina, for your comment. I never realized how lucky I was. Yes. Yes. Thank you. Anyone else have any comments or feedback, or want to say how this activity made them feel or brought up what it brought up for them?
I thought it was kind of interesting that there was parts that kind of had to do with like your family, for example, and maybe your financial situation, but also like you said, like what high school you went to and like what was in your area, where even maybe if it was possible in your area to do something, you might not be able to afford it, or even if you could afford something, it wasn't even there to try.
Mm-hmm. Exactly it. And some of these questions I actually thought of because of the athletes I have already worked with. So I worked with athletes who were people of color who had to live with the coach during high school, so that they were actually at in the district for that high school where they were recruiting for college. And because the high school that they lived, the district they lived in, colleges didn't come to recruit in those inner city districts. And so some of the majority of these questions are based off of actual experience that I either I've had or I know other athletes have had. And so with this activity wheel that I have here, just to emphasize what you all are already saying, which is that depending on different identities and different environmental factors that impact your identities, you are either further or closer away to the academic wheel of privilege. And why I thought this was such an interesting image, I did not make it up, I got it off of Google, is because I know that you all are student athletes, and it is sometimes hard to recognize with all the stress. Sometimes you're further away from that privilege, especially academic wise, and sometimes you're closer. And because for many athletes, their ability to attend college depends on the scholarships that they receive that have to do with their athletic performance in the sports that they play. Does anyone else have any other feedback or anything before I move on? Thank you all for participating. Okay. All right, so these are some definitions of the most common identities, like I said, that are talked about. I put athletic identity at the top, but when you Google intersecting identities, and if anyone wants to, they sure can, you will see that racial, ethnic, gender, sexuality, religion, these are the major ones that come up. Athlete identity does not come up when you search it on Google. And hopefully one day we will change that. And so I'm not going to read these to you because you all can see the screen. But in case you weren't sure of the actual verbiage or language for identities, I thought it was important. So some of the questions got at, when it's asking the intersectionality questions, asking about whether you could afford sports and things like that is because socioeconomic status is actually is an identity. So for some people who grew up in more marginalized communities, oftentimes that means they have lower SES as well. And that's going to impact the education available to them, the sports available to them, all those things. So I did include the socioeconomic identity because of that. Any questions about any of these definitions? Is any of the language surprising to anyone? No? Okay. All right. So this is the problem, which is why I'm doing this, why I wanted to do this workshop, is because oftentimes for athletes, their intersectionality is ignored. And it's ignored based off of assumptions that people have who work with athletes. So I'm talking about coaches, sometimes other athletes, and also the society around them, the environments around them. And so with this slide, I really want to emphasize that these assumptions are based off of biases that people have. So believing that when somebody walks on the field or onto a court, that all the other identities go away. They are just an athlete. And I can tell you from personal experience, my skin has never left my body. I am still Black when I walk onto any court or field. Question, go ahead.
It's not really a question, but I just realized that it says physical abilities or qualities. And when I think of that, I think of like disabilities. If somebody had like, but there's not only physical disabilities, there's also like mental disabilities or intellectual and developmental disorders that can greatly impact someone's one ability to play or like get started, but then also like how they interact with people on the team or how they interact socially in that setting.
Yes, you're exactly right. And again, I did not make this image, but it's not all encompassing, the cycle that they have. Because they're missing one, they don't have athlete, but because no one did, but also they are missing mental health or intellectual disabilities, and they're also missing socioeconomic status in that circle as well, and religion. They're missing several. This was the best one I could find though that had what I wanted it to have on the outside. But I really do appreciate your comment, Abigail, and you're completely right. So part of this, what I want to, the assumptions that people have are based off of some of the research that's out there. And I'm gonna talk more about this in the next slide. But part of the issue is that a lot of that research lacks the social justice lens that's done on athletes and for athletes. And so, like I said, these comments are from actual research that I've done, that I've seen written in papers. So the assumption that only athlete identity is what follows an individual into their sport, which is not true. I'm sure, which is always shocking to me, because even for gender identity, it is clear when people have specific equipment based off of their gender. That they need to wear when they are engaging in sports. So it's always wild to me how even people don't consider that. But they pay women, and they will pay women and male identifying athletes different based off of their gender. And so the misconceptions in literature are ultimately why we want to gather as much information as we can so that we know more, because the experts, they haven't gotten it right yet. So thinking that, again, this is from a study, that for athletes, because they have the privilege of being an athlete, none of their other identities matter, which couldn't be further from the truth. Many researchers suggest that Black athletes are shielded from racism and discrimination, allowing their athlete identities to become primary over their racial identity. That is from a very popular popularized study. And also an article that was done on women of color who engage in distance running, found that women of color who engage in distance running have a change in identity. And this happens after they have an identity crisis once they become an athlete. And they will then choose this, their athlete identity over their racial, gender, and other intersecting identities. That study was done via survey, asking very leading questions. And why I wanted to make sure I put that in there is because that study was from 2018. So some of the studies are, yes, from the 90s, but other studies are actually quite recent, which is concerning. Hope that's better. Okay. So research versus reality. I I know that you all are college students, so I don't want to bog you down too much with thinking about research, but because this is what's fueled the conversation and misconceptions about athletes, it is important for us to for me to discuss it. So one study that was done by Brown et al., which has been used in, I found multiple, I'm talking double digits, studies since it was originally done in 1997. This study was based off of determining if Black athletes in America still experience discrimination or feel like it's an issue. They found that they don't. And so in this study, they devised a survey. Again, they don't have interviews. They're not having interviews with people, which is what we would call the qualitative approach, is to have an interview. These are people who take surveys and rely on people answering strongly worded surveys to determine if their perceptions on discrimination. So in this study, they had a survey which the answers were the answers used a Likert scale. So one was strongly disagree, 6 to 6, which is strongly agree. And in the study, this is the most important key feature. And I'm sure that in some of your classes, you guys are discussing how to actually read research articles and how to grasp information from it. Well, one of the most important things is the power that population has. And so in this Brown article that's widely used and often reproduced and other articles about athletes, the population was of 533 students from 24 predominantly white Division I colleges in the United States. Out of that 533 participants, 97.5 were Black. So that's 1/6 of them were Black. That right there should have been a limitation, and it should have hesitated the researchers in actually drawing any conclusions, but it didn't. So in this article, they asked one question, and that question was to determine if athletes felt like discrimination was still an issue. The question is, discrimination against people of different racial, ethnic groups is no longer a problem in the United States. Does anyone see any concerns about that question? Is that concerning question? Discrimination against people of different race/ethnic groups is no longer a problem in the United States. And then participants were to use the Likert scale and say 1 strongly disagree to 6 strongly agree.
I feel like it's kind of implying that the researchers believe that it's not a problem anymore without like asking the opinion of the athlete.
Exactly, Gianna. That is the problem. So if you're going to ask a survey question, one at that, to determine perceptions of discrimination, you don't want to word it with your belief in it, because by saying that discrimination is no longer a problem in the United States, you are significantly leading the participants to an answer. And so that's why I wanted to emphasize how researchers maybe hurt the intersectionality of athletes at this point, and that not understanding what people are reading and the limitations of these studies has then allowed people to engage in their biases. And in this same study, the authors suggest that Black people who are athletes and athletic are superior to white athletes because they're Black. That was literally written in the study. Does anyone see anything wrong with that?
Going off of what Gianna said earlier, it also has an implicit bias just written into it.
Mm-hmm. It does. So when you speak to a person of color, or a Black person and you say that they're only good at their sports because they're Black, you are actually offending them way more. And you're offending all the other athletes on that team. It's a double whammy offense. And unfortunately, it's something that's commonly said. Because I believe that, I mean, I don't know how you guys are a little bit younger, but I grew up in the era of Larry Bird. Larry Bird was an amazing basketball player. He was white. So it's not that your race makes you a better athlete. Okay. So the other key point that I want to point out is that racial and gender minority groups receive discrimination, whether overtly or subtly. It negatively impacts their performance. And if they perform well, their motivation will eventually decrease and it increases the potential for dropout in sports. And so that is also the motivation for really having a better understanding of how intersectionality impacts athletes. Because like we've talked about, a lot of time researchers are imposing their own bias, putting it out there, and then society accepts this information and they continue with the bias. Oh, did I hear somebody else? Isabel? Isabella, I'm sorry. Did you want to add anything? I think you unmiked. Or unmuted, sorry. Oh, okay. When minorities engage in sport and make it to the elite level, people around them often only see the benefits and increase in resources they receive and stop seeing the drawbacks, which at times leads athletes to endure more racism. And so you all might have heard comments that your other peers make or friends make where they see, it's been in every teen movie ever. There's the jocks, and the jocks have all the power in the school, right? And so then everybody ignores every issue that they actually might be having at home. They could be experiencing traumas. They could be experiencing discrimination, and people just notice the athlete. And because athletes are, especially in this country, are praised for being athletes, people then assume that they forget that they're human beings and their intersecting identities and all the environmental factors impact them as well. Because just because you're an athlete does not take away mental capacity, your brain functioning. It does not stop all those things that everyone else who's not an athlete has. So you have all the range of emotions of everybody, as you're supposed to. And so when we think about the reality, like I said, so many of the studies are authored by men and oftentimes white men, or the lead author is a male. And so that kind of gives you a hint at some of the biases that are going on. And like I talked about, the decreased power of the studies because of the population. Usually people of color are not, they don't get a proper representation of athletes from marginalized communities. So those are people of color, of female athletes, of transgender athletes, disabled athletes. People aren't going out there to those populations to actually get a good representation of them. Also, when it comes to quantitative versus qualitative, so doing a survey is a quicker way to receive information. And so, and it's also thought of in the field of psychology that qualitative studies, which are studies where people are interviewing the participants and actually hearing their words, that those are not thought of as, they're not as highly valued as studies that primarily use surveys. And so I want to touch on safe sport. Some of you probably have heard about safe sport because it's a term often used by the Olympics. And if anyone saw any of the news that's come out in the last 6 or 7 years about safe sport regarding the Olympics, I thought it was important that we touch on that. And so safe sport is defined by the International Olympic Committee as an athletic environment that is respectful, equitable, and free from all forms of harassment and abuse. And so there was actually a study done in 2018 on safe sport, and they interviewed. So they did the rare thing of actually interviewing athletes of all different marginalized communities. And in those interviews, each participant said that they did not feel that safe sport was actually achievable, and also then discussed traumas and events that they've experienced in sport. And so I think it just highlights how much work we have to do. And so I also just quickly want to reference something. I'm not sure if anyone remembers the And One community. Were you all watching the And One games growing up? Or so one of the things that it just made me think of is how publicized the inequity was. So if anyone's familiar, And One is where the basketball players who really had a really significant skill set, but also was entertaining. So they could cross somebody and make them fall, that type of thing. So they all got nicknames, and people were buying And One shorts, basketball shoes based off of these athletes. The Black nicknames were Hot Sauce, Skip to My Lou. And if anyone's familiar with this, they had one white athlete, and he was named the Professor. Does anyone see how that is problematic? It's really interesting because there was a documentary that came out a couple years ago that also where the athletes admitted to pay discrepancies. So the Professor got paid much more, even though he was younger and had less experience, than Hot Sauce and Skip to My Lou. And one of those players had actually made it to the professional level at one point. And so, it's happening. It's actually pretty common, but back then, the athletes didn't have a voice. So nobody was, there was no Black Lives Matter protest about this. And part of that too is because, again, people tend to not get athletes their just due when they are experiencing any type of discrimination. And so the impact for athletes. So I think that you all as educated people understand that discriminating and stereotyping and engaging in bias is systemic. And so that means it can impact the institution, but it also impacts the individual athlete. Oftentimes now, the focus is on the institution and not the individual athletes, like as much as it should be. So people will now go to social media and talk about colleges and places that have not handled discrimination well. And what sort of gets missed is those athletes, those individual athletes who were harmed by this discriminating events. And I think a big key point is why I think if you guys have noticed that having a sports psychologist has become, for a lot of NCAA divisions, mandatory. They have to have somebody on staff, and we play an important role. And part of that is that we allow athletes to address microaggressions and stereotypes committed against them, whether it be in session or helping them advocate for themselves after it's happened, because too often, like I said, those individual athletes are disregarded by the authority figures. They're not considering how they're really doing. As long as they can run and they can play, that's what the focus is. Another really big impact for athletes when it comes to the denial or disregard of intersectionality is self-determination. So within your all's age group, as you're developing into, you're already a young adult, but developing and solidifying your young adulthood, a big key is self-determination and self-efficacy, being able to exude your independence in ways that are necessary. And so oftentimes for athletes, self-determination, athletes' ability to negotiate their resources and voice their opinions, that gets silenced and that gets thrown away to the side, excuse me. It takes for athletes to take to social media, like the U.S. women's soccer team, who came out and discussed the pay discrepancies and called for action, but it took for them to make it public, whereas most of them had been complaining and shouting individually to the people that mattered for years. And so why I say that is that self-determination is really important factor in for athletes to feel like they do have some choice, because it actually impacts their motivation to play. It impacts their performance, the level of choice. And so it does get disregarded. So a couple of ways, like I said, with the U.S. women's soccer team, but also when you notice a professional athlete will leave their team to go to another one. The athletes of color get the harshest criticism. So if anyone can remember when LeBron left the Cavaliers, his coach actually said that he was a narcissist and called him other derogatory names in public during press conferences, when in fact, LeBron was actually engaging his self-determination and ability to negotiate and advocate for himself. But when athletes from the dominant culture are deciding to leave or change teams, they don't get nearly as harsh of criticism. Another example that people can think of, I'm sure none of you were alive during this time, but the 1968 Olympics, I still see it in many athletes' rooms with the poster where the track and field athletes, Tommy Smith and Johnny Carlos, have their fist in the air. You might have seen other peers have that poster in their room. Well, they actually were consequenced and they lost their medals for engaging in their free speech as an athlete during a sporting event. Because again, the only thing that was supposed to matter was that they were an athlete, not the fact that they identified as Black or the fact that they identified as males. And the most, I think, common one that people are aware of is Colin Kaepernick kneeling. If we think about the consequences that he received, how he was isolated, I think that maybe gives you all the best picture, because that's something that's more recent. And this man who was considered a very great quarterback is no longer hireable by the NFL because he actually engaged in free speech. So other impacts for athletes are physical appearance. And again, stop me if you have any questions or if you have any comments on mic or raise your hand. So there was a study done in 2018 that pointed out that Black athletes are reprimanded for showing the sense of agency. And they actually recalled several public events that have happened. And this decreases their ability to actually cope with systemic barriers. Athletes are judged on their physical, ethnic appearance, and visible disabilities often. And so if you think about the Special Olympics and the comments that have been publicized about those athletes or athletes who are transgendered, and that has been a big thing that's been talked about. And a lot of times they're being judged based on their physical appearance. For female identifying athletes, they are criticized if they're more muscular. We can think about Serena Williams and the comments that people have made about her. And so all those things are great athlete. She's human. So hearing people call her names or misgender her based off of her physical appearance offends her female identity. And often people make comments about the fact that she is a Black female, and oftentimes in the media, Black females are seen as more aggressive and violent because they're more muscular. Some of the physical appearance pieces actually creates barriers for women. So I asked one of the questions about if you were told that you can't play a sport because of your hair. For a woman of color, that can be a barrier. So women are told that they're not able to swim because of what it's going to do to their hair. There are also the appearance of their Black hair can be a way that they are actually negatively judged. So if we think about Simone Biles in the Olympics, I've heard Black and white people of all color, comment on her hair. And why isn't it smooth and slicked back when she is one of the greatest gymnasts in the world? Yet she's also experiencing bias and stereotyping and discrimination against her. It also can go into judging. If anyone wants to look up, I think it's called The Losers. It's a Netflix special or Netflix series. And one of the episodes, they focus on Soraya Bonale, who is one of the earlier Black female skaters, figure skaters from, I want to say the 80s, the 70s and 80s. And so while she had great technique, and everyone was discussed how her skill was unbeatable, she was often judged for how she looked. She was too muscular, her hair. So she would lose points. And when she went to the Olympics, she never got a medal. And it's, everyone in the profession discusses how they know that she was not done. She was not treated fairly because of her appearance. So she literally lost medals because of how she's being judged for her appearance. When isolation occurs for people from marginalized communities, this could impact their mental health, their well-being. So isolation can happen in a number of ways, whether it be from living in an environment like an inner city school that doesn't offer soccer or swimming, and maybe you actually really want to play soccer, or your parents come from a country where soccer was popular and it's not something you can access. Isolation also occurs within the athletic community if you are one of the very few marginalized people from marginalized communities on the team. So if you are the only person with a disability, because unfortunately that happens. Like when there's a team with someone who identifies as transgender, there's one, maybe two. So that is also isolating in itself, being the one or one of few on a team.
Can I share something
Please do.
that's like kind of personal? So I have a disability, and I am, as far as I know, the only person on my lacrosse team with a disability. And part of that involves me having a service dog, and it was a big adjustment for my team, for like him to be here. But everyone, honestly, I got very lucky, was very kind and supportive, and it was again a big adjustment for everybody, but like everyone wanted to be a part of that and knew that, what he's here for and to help me. And I feel like I said very lucky because there's probably a lot of people that go through struggles and they need a service dog or they have a different disability requiring different needs and they don't get that support. And that just makes it that much more difficult to participate and, be a part of a team environment like that. So
yes. Thank you, Abigail. Thank you for sharing and sharing part of your identity. And you're exactly right. And while it's an adjustment, it should be a positive experience because you're also adjusting to people who don't know you. And so it's really cool to hear that you did have a supportive team, but you're right, unfortunately, lots of times that doesn't happen for people. A study done on safe sport in 2022 also was able to produce results that showed female, minority, LGBTQ plus IA athletes are more likely to be sexually harassed. So while now people are starting to talk about sexual harassment of females in sport, female identifying people, they are now being more vocal and recognizing that it is also happening more with people who have a disability or identify as having a disability in the queer community. Okay, so, and this is our last slide. So what do you do with this information? This lady's telling me all of this and I have no idea how to use it. So really the most important thing you can do is be receptive to this information and really begin to reflect on yourself and being aware of your cultural values and assumptions, any bias and stereotypes that you have, being aware of it so that you can do the least amount of harm as possible. There are times that you may do harm. I might do harm because I'm human. The important and key part to that is to acknowledge that you have done harm. And if you are able to apologize, but bring awareness to the fact that you have to work on it. Like that what you did was not okay and you got some work to do. So acknowledging power dynamics. When you're an athlete, power dynamics are huge. And it's important for coaches and team staff to recognize that. Oftentimes they don't. But it's important for you to recognize and understand sometimes if I'm feeling more pressure to do something because of the power dynamic, and how is this impacting my identities? Awareness of privilege to play a sport is important, but while also recognizing all the other ways that your identities are impacted by that sport is also key. So when you're identifying your own multiple identities and really understanding that you do have multiple identities, learning how your identities influence your views on sports, your views on cultures, and any stereotypes that you might have, being able to challenge those. And one of the really good applied sports psychology textbooks actually highlights that in ethnic and minority communities, physical activity drops in adolescence. And this is partially because of the environmental concerns, but also because of how minorities are treated in sport. And this is a social justice issue. If that's one thing I can leave you with as far as intersectionality and what to do with it, is to recognize that when your intersectionality is not honored, or different parts of your identity are offended against during sport or by other teammates or staff, that's a social justice issue. So leaning in, being curious, really developing some DEI skills and multicultural competence is going to be the way that you can really help yourself and other people around you. And I also think it's really key to pay attention to the different levels of structural issues. So if you're noticing there's not non-discrimination policies that are being talked about within your team, or that you can actually see for your university, that's a problem. And, finding out who to talk to about that is important. Okay. So any questions, comments? Thank you all for listening. Any questions or comments? If you have a comment or question, you can throw it in the chat too, and I will see it.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. That was so good. Yeah, we'll wait a minute, see if, oh, look at that. We waited a minute and we got
Yep,
something.
we got a question.
Love it. Go for it.
What will you do if you have ignorant teammates, just sort of unaware, says uncaring about intersectionality? Whoo, Juliana, that's a great question. I'm not gonna say what I would do, because I'm a type of person that is okay with cursing out a teammate. That's not for everybody. And I don't recommend it. I've seen the negative consequences of that. I think that if there is somebody you feel comfortable with on a team, whether it's a team trainer, it's the mental health professional attached to the team, being able to tell them, if you're not comfortable, you don't have to confront everybody who's ignorant. If that's not a part that doesn't fit your personality trait, you're not comfortable, that's okay. But you do deserve advocacy. That person does, those teammates do need to be checked. And so whether it is going to a trainer, a coach, a mental health professional, another teammate who is okay with saying stuff out loud, like they can do that, I would encourage you to seek support that way. And then also learn how to protect your energy. So if it is going to be like talking to a brick wall to even address these teammates, knowing that it's a them problem, not a you problem, so that you can protect your energy.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. I think my question is kind of posed from, like, I'm asking for a friend who she definitely educates her teammates, but it's kind of a situation where she's just tired, like, and it's come to a point where it's like she hears a lot of these comments, she'll educate them about certain things, and at that point she has to go into practice bearing the weight, not them.
Yes, and that is not okay. And that is part of the reason why I am suggesting for your friend to find a team staff that they're comfortable with, even if it's the the team therapist, because she's not her job to educate her teammates, but the people of authority should be. Okay. Great.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Any other questions before we wrap up? Okay, what is your response when someone says, is this the hill you're willing to die on? Yes, that's my response when I've been asked that question, is this the hill you're willing to die on? I sure am. I'm gonna take a couple people with me, because this is, it's too important. I also, would like to provide some education to those people that it should be the hill that everyone dies on. Even though I identify as Black and female, I'm still dying on the hill for transgendered athletes, for people who are disabled, for white athletes, for any human who's being offended against. I'm gonna die on the hill. And so that's my response to that. That's a great question, though. Anyone else? Another minute or so. Thank you all. You've been great. Thank you for participating. And I hope this was good information for you all. And you found it helpful. How do you get into this field? Tyra, that's a question. Getting into this field does take a lot of schooling, and I'm just going to be real. The American education institution is not made for marginalized communities. So it's difficult, but I first started with my master's, and knowing I wanted to work in the psychology field, and then understanding I wanted to marry my passion of sports, of being a former athlete, and still being really interested in sports. So went back and got my doctorate. You can do this at a master's level, though. And so it does take some graduate degree. So after college, at least a master's level, which is a graduate degree or a doctorate. Good question. I'll stop sharing my screen. Any other last comments or questions or anything before we close out? What are some policy changes you want to see in this area? Wow, that's a great question. There are many, too many for me to list, but I actually think that one of the biggest ones is, I am hoping, my dream is that when every athlete comes to college, that they have to the coaches staff have to give them an athlete identity questionnaire, as well as a questionnaire that asks them about their other identities, so their gender, their sexual identity, all of those. They have to complete that, and they have to have in that athlete's file information on how they identify, and understanding environmental stressors they may have. So if you're a caregiver, all that stuff and if you have any mental health or physical disabilities or invisible disabilities, would have to be in that file. I've met some coaches and athletes who are on the autism spectrum. Coaches don't know. So they're wondering why they're so reactive when they're yelling. So that's one major policy change, is that you have to learn actual information about athletes' identities when they get to college, because you are part of their care team. So that's one big policy change that I know right now is not something that happens. Do you have any advice for us individuals, or things we can do to help this problem? Yes, the biggest thing would just be aware of your identities and any biases you have, and on an individual level, because everyone has some level of biases. So being aware of them, being willing to be uncomfortable and having uncomfortable conversations, because those people from marginalized communities are always uncomfortable. So athletes who are the one disabled person on the team, as Abigail mentioned, she's uncomfortable. So the rest of the people around her get to be uncomfortable too, and have uncomfortable conversations. So I would just tell you to lean into being uncomfortable and really try to do your best to acknowledge any discrepancies, and any offenses that have happened to anyone's identities. That's really the first thing that you can do. And then depending on your degree, to help with some policy change.
So good. I loved this so much. We are right at time. But if there's any other questions, I'm wondering if Matisha, but it's okay.
I was
People
gonna say
send
I'll put my
questions
email
your
in the
way.
chat. Is that okay?
Perfect. Yeah,
Yeah.
please. Absolutely. We really appreciate your time. This was so fantastic. Such an important conversation. So necessary. So thank you all so much for being here.